Okay, let's dive right into this. We're going to tackle a question that seems almost laughably simple, one posed by the brilliant Marxian critic Terry Eagleton. And for a thinker like Eagleton, asking a question like this is never just about words on a page. No, it's always about uncovering the hidden systems of value, society, and power that secretly shape everything we read. So here it is. What is literature? I mean, before we can even begin to talk about literary theory, we have to know what it is we're actually theorizing about. You'd think the answer would be obvious, right? We know it when we see it. But as we're about to find out, Eagleton shows us that our common sense answers, well, they completely fall apart under the slightest bit of pressure. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because what Eagleton does so masterfully is not to give us some new, perfect definition. Instead, he takes us on this kind of deconstructive journey to show us that the search for one stable, essential definition of literature is pretty much a wild goose chase. So let's follow his method. We're going to take the most common definitions that people throw around, line them up one by one, and see exactly where and why they just don't work. All right, first up, the big one. This is the go-to answer for most people. Literature is fiction. You know, stories that aren't literally true. It's the stuff of imagination. Sounds plausible enough, doesn't it? But then you look at this, and the whole idea just collapses. Think about what we actually study as English literature. It's packed with factual writing. Francis Bacon's essays, John Donne's sermons, even Gibbon's massive history of the Roman Empire. And at the same time, we kick a huge amount of fiction, like Superman comics or romance novels, out of that high-status club of literature with a capital L. So, you see the point? The line between fact and fiction is not only super blurry, it's a terrible guide for what we actually decide to call literature. This first attempt, it's a definite bust. Okay, so let's try a different angle. Maybe literature isn't about what you say, but how you say it. This was the big idea from this really fascinating group of critics called the Russian formalists. They argue that literary language is special, it's heightened, it's even a kind of deviation from the normal, everyday language we all use. And I mean, listen to this quote from the formalist critic Roman Jakobson. He called literature an organized violence committed on ordinary speech. It's such a powerful image, right? If you hear someone say, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness" at the grocery store, you know instantly you're not hearing ordinary speech. Their core concept for this was a fancy word, defamiliarization. But the idea is simple. Literature takes the language we use every day, language that's become so automatic we don't even notice it, and it twists it, makes it strange, and forces us to really see the world and the words themselves in a completely fresh way. It's a beautiful idea. It really is. But, and this is a huge but, Eagleton immediately pokes a hole in it. The entire theory depends on this idea that there's a single, stable, ordinary language to deviate from. But is there really? I mean, think about it. What's ordinary for an Oxford professor is hardly the same as what's ordinary for a dock worker in Glasgow. What sounds all poetic and strange to us from a 15th century text might have been totally mundane back then. One person's normal is another person's poetry. It's all relative. And that's really the nail in the coffin for this definition. Literariness, that special quality, isn't something that's baked into the words themselves. It's a relationship between one kind of language and another. And that relationship changes completely depending on the social and historical context. Okay, we're 2 for 2 on failed definitions. Let's try the third and final common argument. Maybe literature is writing that doesn't have an immediate practical use. You know, a car repair manual is pragmatic. A poem about a sunset isn't. It's about a general state of affairs, not serving some direct purpose. But again, Eagleton finds the flaw. This definition actually shifts the whole focus away from the text and onto the reader. Because really, any text can be read non-pragmatically. You could read a bus schedule not for the times, but to meditate on the rhythms of urban life. Does that suddenly make it literature? And this is where Eagleton has this fantastic line that just sums up the whole problem perfectly. Some texts start out as history or philosophy or whatever, and then, centuries later, they become literature. It's not about what a text is, it's about how a society decides to treat it. So, all the classic definitions have completely crumbled. And this right here, this is the moment where Eagleton makes his crucial move. He pivots from trying to define literature to asking a totally different and frankly much more powerful kind of question. The problem isn't that we can't find the right answer. The problem is that we've been asking the wrong question all along. We've been looking for some fixed, inherent qualities, some literary essence, and it just isn't there. We need to make a shift. We've been asking an ontological question. Basically, what is this thing in its essence? Eagleton says we need to switch to a functional question. What do we do with a text when we call it literature? How does that label make it operate in our culture? And this leads to probably his most famous and, frankly, most brilliant analogy. Literature, he says, isn't a specific species of writing. It works like the word weed. Think about it. A weed isn't a scientific botanical category. A dandelion is a weed in your lawn, but not in a salad. A weed is just any plant that a gardener decides is in the wrong place. And literature is any piece of writing that a particular society, for its own reasons, decides to value in a special way. And that word, value, that's the key that unlocks everything. This is where we get to the absolute heart of Eagleton's Marxian analysis. If literature is defined by value judgments, then we have to ask the most important question of all. Where do those judgments come from? And for Eagleton, the answer is ideology. Now, when Eagleton says ideology, he doesn't just mean your political party affiliation. It's much deeper, much more subtle than that. It's the whole invisible web of feelings, values, and beliefs that we all share. Beliefs that quietly connect our personal tastes to the bigger structures of social power. And to show this isn't just some abstract theory, Eagleton points to a famous experiment. Back in the 1920s, a Cambridge critic named I.A. Richards gave his elite students a bunch of poems, but with the author's names stripped off. The results were absolute chaos. Famous canonical poets were torn to shreds, while total unknowns were hailed as geniuses. Richards thought this proved that literary taste was just random and subjective. But Eagleton's reinterpretation is just wow. He argues that Richards completely missed the most important finding. Yeah, on the surface, they all disagreed, but underneath all that noise, there was a powerful unspoken consensus, a shared ideology about what poetry was supposed to be and do. Their judgments weren't just literary, they were deeply shaped by their shared background as privileged young men in 1920s England. So, after all of this, where does it leave us? Well, Eagleton has just systematically taken apart every single attempt to find a stable, objective, timeless definition of literature. And he arrives at this, his most famous and provocative conclusion. He says that the very idea of literature as some fixed collection of books with guaranteed unchangeable value, something with shared inherent properties that you can pin down like an insect, it simply does not exist. So here's the bottom line. What we call the literary canon, that list of great works from Homer to Shakespeare that we're all taught, it isn't some timeless truth that was handed down from the heavens. It's a social construct. It was built by particular people, for particular reasons, at a particular point in history. And that leaves us with one final, unavoidable, and maybe even uncomfortable question. If literature itself is an ideological construct, and the canon of great works is a product of social power, then we are forced to ask, whose ideology are we inheriting? Whose values are we celebrating every time we open a book and call it great?